Diego Martinez was one of the richest men in Spain, but also one of the most desperate. For 3 years, her 4-year-old autistic daughter, Lucia, hadn't said a word and spent her days obsessively pointing out the window of her Madrid attic. Doctors, psychologists, and therapists couldn't explain what this silent girl, who seemed to see something no one else could see, was looking for. Until the day he hired Carmen Lopez, a 39-year-old domestic worker who everyone considered strange because she talked too much and asked too many questions. What Carmen discovered by following Lucia's gaze toward that window would shock Diego. Her daughter wasn't just looking out, she was trying to save someone. And when the employee did the unthinkable, ignoring her boss's orders to follow the instincts of an autistic child, a miracle occurred that would forever change the life of a wealthy, but broken, family. Sometimes it takes the pure heart of a special child to teach adults what it truly means to see. Diego Martinez woke up at 6 a.m. in his 9,000 square meters suite overlooking Madrid, listening to the silence that already characterized his life. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy silence of a house where a 4-year-old girl had never spoken a word, at least not to him. By the age of 40, Diego owned a financial empire that generated revenues of more than $2 billion a year. Martinez holdings spanned from real estate to technology, and he was considered one of the most brilliant entrepreneurs of his generation. But all his success paled in comparison to the one challenge he couldn't overcome: communicating with his daughter, Lucia. Lucia was born apparently normal, a beautiful girl, with big green eyes and blonde hair. For the first 2 years, she had been lively and curious. Then, gradually, the withdrawal began. First, he stopped responding to his name. Then he lost the few words he had learned. He finally shut himself away in a world of his own. The autism diagnosis came when Lucia was 3.5 years old, devastating Diego and his wife Isabel. The doctors explained that Lucia lived in a different perceptual reality, where sounds, lights, and stimuli were processed in unique ways. But the clinical explanations didn't help Diego understand why his daughter would spend hours at the living room window, pointing at something he couldn't see. Isabel could not stand the pressure. After months of failed therapies and sleepless nights, I had packed my bags one morning while Diego was at the office. She had left only a note that spoke of guilt and the need for time to understand herself. He had left for Argentina, where he had family, 8 months ago, and his calls were becoming increasingly rare. Diego found himself alone with Lucia and an endless procession of nannies, therapists, and specialists. She had transformed part of the attic into a private therapy center, hiring the best professionals in Europe, but nothing seemed to reach her daughter. The most frustrating thing was Lucia's behavior at the window. Every day, from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., he would position himself in front of the large window overlooking the Salamanca district and begin to point. I didn't look at the buildings or the traffic. His finger always pointed in the same direction, toward something that Diego couldn't identify. I had Lucia's eyesight checked, which was perfect. I had consulted neurologists, no abnormalities. He had even had sound frequencies or vibrations checked. Nothing. Lucia ate little, slept poorly, and her only moment of calm was when she stood at the window with her finger pointing toward that invisible mystery. That October morning, as he was getting dressed for the office, Diego looked at Lucia already positioned in front of the window in her favorite red jumpsuit. He pointed with the precision of a GPS, his green eyes fixed on an exact point on the Madrid horizon. The 15th nanny had resigned the night before, citing a situation that was too complex to handle. Diego was tired of psychologists who talked about behavioral therapies, of doctors who prescribed drugs, of specialists who saw Lucia as a case study instead of as a child. He made a decision that would change everything. I would hire a simple domestic worker, someone to take care of the house and watch over Lucia without trying to cure her. Someone who would accept Lucia for who she was, not who she should become. He didn't know that this decision would lead him to Carmen Lopez, a 40-year-old woman whom everyone considered eccentric, and who would be the only person to truly understand what her daughter was looking for beyond that window. Carmen Lopez arrived at Diego Martinez's penthouse one November morning with a cardboard suitcase, an infectious smile, and that loquacity that made most rich people uncomfortable. By the age of 40, he had worked in dozens of stately homes, but had never managed to hold a position for more than a few months. The problem was always the same. He asked too many questions, took too much interest in his employers' lives, and, above all, he didn't know how to keep his place. Diego had chosen her because she was the only candidate who hadn't asked questions about Lucia's difficult case. Carmen had only said that special children were her favorites because they saw the world with purer eyes than adults. The first meeting between Carmen and Lucia was silent but intense. As Diego explained the daily routine, Carmen approached the girl, who was in her usual position in front of the window. Instead of trying to distract or move her, Carmen knelt beside her and began looking in the same direction, softly whispering what she saw as so important out there. Diego expected Lucia's usual lack of reaction, but instead the girl turned her head slightly toward Carmen, as if for the first time someone had asked the right question. In the first few days, Carmen completely revolutionized the household routine. Instead of trying to get Lucia away from the window, he brought her a comfortable chair and sat next to her. Instead of playing relaxing music, as the therapist suggested, he respected the child's need for silence, and above all, instead of talking constantly as he did with everyone else, with Lucia he used only the essential words. But the strangest thing was that Carmen had started taking notes. Every hour he recorded in a notebook the exact position of Lucia's finger, the weather conditions, the time, and even the slightest changes in the girl's facial expression. When Diego questioned her, Carmen explained with disarming candor that, according to her, Lucia wasn't just looking. He was looking at something specific, perhaps looking for someone, and the only way to understand it was to pay attention to the details that escape distracted adults. Diego was skeptical, but he couldn't deny that Lucia seemed calmer since Carmen had arrived. The girl ate better, slept more peacefully, and had even begun to look for Carmen when she woke up in the morning. A week after Carmen's arrival, something extraordinary happened. Diego was working in his studio when he heard a sound he hadn't heard in months. Lucia laughing. He ran into the living room and found her still standing in front of the window. But this time he wasn't just pointing. He was clapping, jumping on his feet, and laughing as he looked outside. Carmen was standing next to her with binoculars, looking in the same direction she was looking. When Diego asked what was happening, Carmen handed him the binoculars, inviting him to look where Lucia was pointing. Diego pointed the binoculars in the direction of his daughter's finger. At first he saw only the usual buildings, the streets, the traffic. Then, following the angle better, he focused on a small playground across the street. And there, on a bench, he saw a figure that took his breath away. An old woman in a blue coat. He always sat on the same bench, every day, at the same time, looking towards Diego's attic. She didn't look at the buildings or the view. She looked directly out her window, as if she knew someone was watching her. Carmen explained that Lucia saw her every day. The girl was not pointing into space, but towards that lady. Diego lowered his binoculars. Confused as to why her daughter was so interested in a stranger, Carmen turned to him with a serious expression he had never seen before. I didn't know who that woman was yet, but Lucia knew. Children like her perceive things that adults have forgotten. Invisible connections, unexpressed needs, souls calling each other without words. Then he added something that changed everything for Diego. What if that lady needed help? What if Lucia had understood it before all of them? At that moment, Diego realized that perhaps his daughter wasn't locked away in an inaccessible world. Perhaps she was the only one who could see clearly while everyone else was blind. Carmen couldn't get the image of the old woman on the bench out of her mind. That night she asked Diego for permission to go down to the park and talk to that woman. Diego hesitated, but he had seen Lucia more serene in recent days. If Carmen thought there was a connection, maybe it was worth investigating. The next morning, Carmen crossed the street to the small park. As I expected, the old woman was already in her pew. Up close, she was a woman in her 70s, dressed carefully, but in clothes that had seen better days. She had neatly tied gray hair and blue eyes that betrayed deep sadness. Carmen approached gently, and the woman introduced herself as Esperanza Ruiz. She was a widow and lived alone, without a pension and with few savings. Her children lived far away and rarely called her. She spent her days walking around Madrid because being alone at home depressed her. She came to that park because from that bench she could see the window where she sometimes saw a little girl looking at her. Carmen felt a chill. Lucia wasn't just looking at Esperanza. The two had recognized in their loneliness an autistic girl who could not communicate with the world, and an elderly woman whom the world had forgotten. When she returned to the attic, Carmen told Diego everything. His daughter had a gift. I saw the pain of others. I felt who needed help. Esperanza was dying of loneliness on that bench, and Lucia had understood it immediately. Diego looked toward the living room, where Lucia was at the window. For the first time in years, she saw her daughter not as a sick child, but as an extraordinarily sensitive being who perceived the world with an intensity that adults had lost. Carmen's proposal was revolutionary: to invite Esperanza up, to make two souls who had already recognized each other meet. It was crazy. But looking at Lucia, who was pointing toward the bench with unprecedented determination, Diego understood that madness was exactly what they needed. Esperanza Ruiz climbed into Diego's attic with her heart pounding, feeling out of place in her patch coat. But Carmen had welcomed her with such affection that her initial shyness was fading away. Diego watched from behind the door of his study, worried that Hope's presence might upset Lucia. But what happened exceeded all expectations. As soon as Esperanza entered Lucia's field of vision, the girl turned away from the window for the first time in months, her green eyes fixed on the lady's wrinkled face, and for an eternal moment, the two remained motionless, gazing at each other. Then Lucia did something incredible. She slowly approached Esperanza and took her hand. The woman became emotional as she squeezed the little hand that trusted her so completely. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. Lucia didn't respond when Esperanza greeted her, but led the lady to the window, showing her the bench from her perspective. Lucia sat next to Esperanza on the sofa, resting her little head against her arm. Esperanza began to tell stories of her youth, of the Madrid of yesteryear, of her mechanic husband. Lucia listened to her with the attention she never showed with psychologists or therapists. After an hour, the miracle happened. Esperanza was talking about the flowers her husband brought her when Lucia ran to her room and came back with a drawing of colorful flowers that no one had understood. He placed it in Hope's hands with solemnity that made the woman cry. Diego came out of his hiding place in amazement. Lucia had communicated voluntarily, offering a gift from the heart. He made Esperanza an incredible proposal. Would you agree to come every day as Lucia's grandmother? Esperanza had nothing to offer, but Diego explained that he had what money couldn't buy. She had understood her daughter in an hour, something that specialists had not achieved in years. That afternoon, Lucia ran to the window, not to point sadly, but to greet her new friend. For the first time in years, Diego saw his daughter smile with pure joy. In the weeks that followed, Diego's attic transformed into something he had never imagined: a true home. Esperanza arrived every morning at 9, always wearing her blue coat and her gentle smile, and Lucia ran to greet her with joy that amazed anyone who saw her. Diego had installed Esperanza in one of the guest rooms, insisting that there was no point in her returning each night to her dark, cold apartment. At first, Esperanza had refused, feeling uncomfortable with such generosity. But Lucia had resolved the matter, dragging Esperanza by the hand into the room and showing her where she kept her toys. The daily routine had changed completely. Lucia no longer spent her days at the window pointing toward the park. Instead, he sat next to Esperanza while she sewed. He brought his drawings to show her, and had even begun to imitate his grandmother's gestures when she took care of the plants that Diego had bought. Carmen watched this change with pride and excitement. I had understood that Lucia didn't need therapists trying to normalize her, but people who accepted her and loved her for who she was. Esperanza, with her infinite patience and big heart, had achieved what all the specialists had failed to do. But the real miracle happened one December afternoon, while Esperanza was telling Lucia the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Diego was working in his studio when he heard a sound that made him drop the pen from his hands. His daughter's voice. Lucia had clearly pronounced the words "bad wolf," pointing to the illustration in the book. Diego ran into the living room, where Esperanza's eyes were filled with tears of joy. Lucia had said her first words after 2 years of silence at the most natural moment in the world, commenting on a story that interested her. When Diego whispered in disbelief that he had spoken, Esperanza sweetly replied that he had always spoken, only they didn't know how to listen. From that moment on, Lucia gradually began to use more words, not long conversations, but simple, direct phrases that expressed her needs and feelings. He called Esperanza grandmother and Carmen aunt. And for the first time he called Diego dad instead of ignoring him. The most beautiful change concerns the weekends. Diego had always spent Saturdays and Sundays at the office, unsure how to manage his free time with an uncommunicative daughter. Now she organized trips to the park where Lucia would happily run chasing pigeons, visits to museums where the little girl would be enchanted by the colorful paintings, and afternoons at home where they would all bake sweets and watch cartoons together. Esperanza had become the perfect grandmother, always ready to pamper Lucia, but also firm when necessary. She had learned to recognize the child signs when she was overwhelmed by stimuli and knew how to calm her with hugs and sweetly whispered words. Carmen had found her perfect role as a bridge between worlds. She, who had always talked too much, had now learned the value of silence and nonverbal communication. She was the one who prepared Lucia's favorite meals, organized educational games, and took care of practical needs, leaving Esperanza and Diego the space to build an emotional bond with the girl. One night, while they were all having dinner together, Diego looked at that surreal scene. A millionaire, a chatty employee, a poor old lady, and an autistic girl, sitting at the same table, laughing at a joke Esperanza had told. Diego confessed to Esperanza that when Carmen had first told him about her, he had thought she was crazy. He didn't understand why his daughter was obsessed with a stranger in a bank. Esperanza smiled with the wisdom that comes from experience. And when Diego asked him what he thought now, he looked at Lucia, who was showing her drawing of vegetables to Hope, then to Carmen, who was serving dessert with the smile of someone who knows she has contributed to a miracle. Now he thought his daughter was smarter than all of them put together. He had recognized in Hope what had taken him time to understand. A special person who needed to love and be loved just like her. Hope. He took Lucia's hand and Diego's, creating a chain that symbolized the family they had become. He explained that children like Lucia see with their hearts before their eyes and know how to recognize good souls, even when they hide behind loneliness or wealth. That night, while putting Lucia to bed, Diego asked her if she liked Grandma Esperanza. Lucia looked at him with those green eyes that now shone with happiness instead of confusion. And he said in a clear voice the longest sentence he had ever uttered. Her grandmother Esperanza, father, and Aunt Carmen all had good hearts, and Lucia finally had a family. It was the perfect synthesis of what they had become, a family born of understanding, acceptance, and pure love. A year after that first meeting, life in Diego's attic had changed in ways no one could have imagined. Lucia, now 6 years old, attended a special school where her progress amazed teachers and therapists. He spoke regularly, albeit in simple sentences, expressed his feelings, and had developed a passion for puzzles and painting. But the most profound change concerned Diego himself. The man who once worked 14 hours a day had learned that the most important success is not measured by balance sheets, but in smiles. Every evening he returned home knowing that Lucia was waiting for him with her drawings, Esperanza with her stories, and Carmen with dinner ready and 1,000 anecdotes from the day. Esperanza had become part of the family. Diego had offered to legally adopt her as Lucia's grandmother, and she had accepted with tears in her eyes. She was no longer the lonely, forgotten woman who sat on a bench, but the beating heart of a family who adored her. Carmen had found the perfect job of her life. She was no longer a servant who moved house every few months, but a loving aunt who had helped create a miracle. Diego had given her a permanent contract and an apartment in the same area, because Lucia couldn't imagine life without her chatty aunt. The real surprise came one spring afternoon when the attic doorbell rang. Diego opened it and was speechless. It was Isabel, his wife, who had returned from Argentina after more than a year of absence. Isabel explained in an uncertain voice that she had returned, that she had realized she had made a terrible mistake by leaving. Diego looked at her, noticing how thinner and tired she seemed. He then introduced the two women who had saved his daughter, Hope and Carmen. And above all, he showed her how Lucia had changed. In the following days, Isabel had to face a reality completely different from the one she had left. Lucia was no longer the silent, withdrawn girl who had driven her to despair. She was a serene, affectionate girl who communicated with simple but clear words, and who had built deep bonds with people Isabel didn't know. At first, Isabel felt jealous and excluded. Esperanza had taken her place as a maternal reference figure, and Lucia seemed more attached to her adoptive grandmother than to her biological mother. But gradually, guided by Esperanza's infinite patience and Carmen's practical wisdom, she began to understand what Diego had learned. Lucia didn't need to be changed, but to be loved for who she was. The moment of truth came when Isabel tried to resume the old behavioral therapies that had so stressed Lucia. The girl reacted by withdrawing again, refusing to eat, and returning to obsessive behaviors she hadn't displayed for months. Esperanza intervened firmly, surprising everyone, declaring that Lucia was fine just the way she was. She didn't need to be fixed, she needed to be understood. Isabel burst into tears, confessing to feeling like a failure as a mother, unable to accept that her daughter was different, and hoping that time away would help her find the strength to change Lucia. Diego hugged his wife, explaining that the problem wasn't Lucia, but the adults who expect children to adapt to their world instead of learning to enter hers. Esperanza took Lucia in her arms, whispering a lullaby to calm her. Then he turned to Elizabeth with the compassion of one who has lived long and forgiven everything. She explained that she too didn't understand Lucia at first, but the girl had taught her that true love doesn't seek to change the other. True love accepts, protects, and finds beauty even in diversity. It took time, but gradually Isabel learned to see Lucia with new eyes. Under Hope's guidance, she began to communicate with her daughter through gestures, glances, and small daily rituals. He learned that Lucia expressed affection in different but equally profound ways, and that her apparent distance concealed extraordinary sensitivity. The family was reunited, but not as before. She had grown older, richer in affection, more aware of the value of small things. Diego had learned that true wealth was not in his billions, but in the moments of pure joy with his daughter. Isabel had discovered that being a mother meant accepting unconditionally, not molding according to one's own desires. Esperanza had found the family she thought she had lost forever, and Carmen had proven that an employee's instinct could be worth more than all the titles in the world. But above all, Lucia had taught them all the most important lesson, that every person, no matter how different, has something unique and precious to offer the world. That autism is not a disease to be cured, but a diversity to be celebrated. And sometimes it takes the pure heart of a special child to remember adults. What it really means to see, love, and be human. That afternoon, as they all watched Lucia paint a picture full of bright colors, Diego realized that the miracle hadn't been curing his daughter. The miracle had been learning that she had never needed to be cured. She was perfect exactly as she was, and had only hoped that the world around her would become wise enough to understand it. Like if you believe every special child is a precious gift. Comment on which moment in history touched you the most. Share to inspire those who live with autism or love someone different. Subscribe for more stories of families formed from the heart. Sometimes it takes a curious employee to see what the experts miss. Sometimes an unknown grandmother knows how to love better than 1,000 therapists. And sometimes autistic children are the wisest of all, because they see the world with their hearts. Because diversity is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be celebrated. Yeah. Oh,